As part of the Pledge Consulting team, I help organisations across Australia find the right project delivery, PMO and project controls talent so they can deliver projects, programs and portfolios more successfully. The session will be recorded, so if you have to pop off at any point or you'd like to rewatch it, it will be available to you. So I think that's going to start now. We have about 40 minutes for today's session called Inside Recruitment, how we build teams for complex projects. So I'm super excited to present this to you because this really is my day in and day out. And what I want to do today is take you behind the scenes of how we actually recruit when things get complicated. Whether that means stakes are high, the project itself is complex, the environment is fast moving, or the organisation are managing, delivery risks or issues and need the right person to come in and solve a problem. I will do this today by taking you through a 4-step hiring process that works as a bit of a framework to guide you through these complexities, from understanding and designing a role through to screening candidates and interviewing with intention. As we go along, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Daniela will be monitoring the chat and I will either answer as I go or at the end of the presentation. I'm sure we'll have a little bit of time then. Alternatively, do feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to have a chat about your individual hiring circumstances and challenges as well. All right. Before I jump into things, I want to tell you a little bit about my day-to-day. Sometimes my job looks a lot like getting handed a complete job description and that role needing to be filled ASAP. And of course, we can and will happily fill those roles, but the truth is my favourite part of recruitment is when I get to work with a client to really solve their problems. The work I love most is when I sit down with a client and unpack what's actually happening in the project or the broader program or PMO environment. What's missing, what's unclear, what's failing, and then we design the role or the team around what's required. Because complex projects don't succeed just because you've filled a vacancy. They succeed because you put the right capability in the right place at the right time. And ultimately, success in these environments is a reflection of the strength of capability of the people involved. So today, I'm not going to talk about recruitment as a transactional process. I'm going to talk about recruitment as a delivery enabler, a resource management lever that you can pull and move and manipulate to get a desired delivery outcome. Because the fact is that in complex environments, recruitment is one of the most powerful ways to reduce risk and improve outcomes before delivery even begins in some cases. So I guess my overarching aim today is for you to walk away from the next 40 minutes with a bit of insight into the way that Pledge Consulting think about and approach recruitment. Perfect. All right, so let's start with the first step. And honestly, the step most people skip when recruiting. But this really, really sets the foundations for the rest of the recruitment journey. We start by diagnosing complexity. To recruit for complex projects, you first need to understand what complexity means within the given organisation or even just the given project or program. If you don't understand complexity or the complexity of the environment, you will almost always recruit the wrong profile. And what I mean by wrong is not that the person is bad at what they do, it's that they're misaligned to the pressures and intricacies and know-how of the project at hand and the project that you're hiring for. So what is complexity and what does it look like? In complex projects, complexity usually shows up in areas like multiple stakeholders with competing priorities, high visibility and governance like steering committees or boards, tight timeframes and shifting scope, regulatory requirements as well. So often we're referring to highly regulated industries here. High dependency environments, in other words, complex initiatives where the completion of one task is heavily reliant on the successful completion of prior tasks. Organisational change and resistance, we've all come across stakeholders that push back against or are seemingly unwilling to accept change. And it often takes a very nuanced and soft-skilled approach to influence these stakeholders. Also managing vendors and third parties, or simply a lot of ambiguity within an environment is enough to define it as complex, where answers aren't always immediately obvious. And what I always say is that if the project is complex, the role is complex, and the hiring approach really needs to match that complexity. And that doesn't mean over-engineering the hiring process. It means being very intentional at each step of the hiring process. When I am working with a client, I do tend to ask a different set of questions than what you may have typically been asked as a hiring manager in the past for your typical job brief. And this is with the specific purpose of determining how complexity is defined by the organisation. So, for example, what does success look like in the first 90 days? What decisions will this person need to make early? Where has delivery struggled previously? What risks are already present in the environment? What types of stakeholder behaviours are they walking into? And also candid questions like, what's the cultural reality, not the aspirational culture? And what do you not want repeated from your last hire? That's one I tend to ask quite a lot, actually. I usually think of the job description, which we will come to next in the designing the role phase in step 2, as only part of the picture. It shows it shows the surface, but the real need sits within the delivery context, and these questions define the delivery context. So step 1 is diagnose complexity. And I want to emphasise that this really is the foundation of recruitment. When you skip this step, you don't just risk a slower hire. If you don't understand the environment this new hire is being asked to operate in, you risk a hire who looks great on paper, but cannot operate effectively inside the organisational environment. Perfect, okay. Okay, so we've diagnosed complexity now. Now we move into what I personally think is the most valuable part of recruitment. We translate the complexity into role requirements and we design the role. So for context, steps 1 and 2 are taken prior to going to market. This step is where you're able to stop hiring for a job description and start hiring for delivery-based outcomes. And when my clients begin to approach hiring in this way, it naturally becomes far more strategic, the whole recruitment process. Most job descriptions are written to cover responsibilities, and that's completely fair enough. We have a role responsibilities section in each of our job descriptions as well. I'm not saying to throw that out the window, but complex roles aren't defined by responsibilities, and especially not responsibilities alone. They're defined by ability to think clearly and deliver under pressure and make clear-headed decisions. And they're defined by what happens when things go wrong. And this is why you can hire someone who's technically qualified or even technically excellent and still have delivery issues, because the person may have the skills but not the behaviours to match the environment. Or they might have the correct experience but not the correct experience in maturity for the stakeholder environment. Or they might have worked in projects but not this kind of project as well. So if there's one takeaway from this step, it's don't just define what the role does, define what the role needs to deliver and how the person needs to operate when things aren't going to plan. I will keep this slide pretty high level because the design phase is a very role dependent part of this process. So instead, let me give you an example I recently faced instead on the next slide. But essentially, step 2 of designing the role and really understanding the soft skills and behaviours is another foundational step that will allow you to screen and assess candidates, which is coming up in step 3 and 4, in a far more clear-headed way. Perfect. So I thought this was a good place to briefly pause for our first case study of the session. And that's here to really highlight some of the things that we've just discussed. Late last year, we were engaged by a client who initially came to us and said, we need a senior project manager. Cool, easy enough, right? And on the surface, that sounds very straightforward. But when we sat down and really unpacked the environment, a very different sort of picture started to emerge. So this was a greenfield environment, meaning there was no sort of established ways of working. It was a renewable energy organisation, so operating within a highly regulated critical infrastructure setting, meaning the stakes were high. They had an aggressive delivery timeline working towards a stage gate before the end of the year. And they were implementing a very specialised enterprise asset management platform with a vendor heavily involved within the delivery process. So yes, they needed a senior PM, right? But more importantly, they needed someone who had experience stepping into ambiguity and creating structure from scratch. They need someone who had or could operate confidently in a regulated, high governance environment, who has managed both internal stakeholders and an external vendor, and also still be able to drive progress under significant time pressures. And that is a very different hire to a senior PM coming from a stable, well-established program. So instead of just recruiting against the title, we designed the role around these realities that I've just covered. We prioritised experience in greenfield environments, exposure to critical infrastructure and regulated industries, and importantly, proven delivery of asset management or similar technology platforms. because without that combination, the risk of misalignment was very high. And this is the part I genuinely enjoy most about my role, because at that point, you're not just filling a vacancy or a job description. We're helping the client solve a very real delivery challenge. And when you get that clarity up front, the search becomes more focused. The conversations with candidates become more meaningful. And ultimately, the person you hire is set up to succeed in that environment, not just on paper. And I'm very happy to report we found the right fit, and the feedback continues to be outstanding. And that truly speaks to the talent of the candidate, but also the importance of the initial and foundational steps 1 and 2 we've covered so far in the session. I will pause here. Do we have any questions so far, Danielle? Okay, perfect. Well, let me just grab a sip of water and we will move on to the next slide. All right, back to our favourite part as project and PMO people, the process. So let's touch on step 3, finding and testing for real delivery capability. Once we know what we're hiring for, we move into the sourcing and assessment phase of recruiting. So step 3 is sourcing specifically. This is where we go to market, start looking at applications and CVs and screening our candidates. And this is where I hear a lot of hiring managers tell me that they feel stuck, because the market is noisy, especially at the moment. And we have seen a really steep increase in the number of not only applications, but low quality applications, that is AI generated resumes, and honestly just candidates with very poor alignment to role requirements. And I guess while we're on the topic of noise in the market, I will touch on why I think it feels particularly obvious right now. After the sort of surge that we had in hiring during COVID, we saw a significant slowdown. Projects were paused, budgets tightened, and organisations focused on doing more with less. Now, activity is picking up again, particularly in government-funded areas like energy, infrastructure, and defence. But the key difference is hiring has become far more intentional. Budgets are still tight, so organisations are being very deliberate about the skills they bring in and when they bring them in. It's actually a very large reason I decided to focus on this topic for this webinar, to give those recruiting or those thinking about recruiting and an idea of how to go about the process with a bit more intention and remain in control throughout the entire recruitment process. But back to the slide in front of us. Look, a CV can look impressive and a LinkedIn profile can sound perfect, but complex delivery capability is not something we can always spot in the first 30 seconds of screening a profile. So our approach must be consistent and it must be structured to get the most out of the hiring process, at least. We look for evidence of capability rather than just experience through metrics including delivery outcomes, ownership and accountability, governance exposure, stakeholder engagement, risk and issue management, and also evidence of working through ambiguity, evidence of working in pressured environments, as well as how they operate when plans change. And a big one, have they delivered in environments where the project isn't neatly defined upfront? In this slide, in this slide here, I have also quickly touched on what I believe is one of the biggest recruitment traps, and that is hiring someone based on what they've been exposed to. In other words, what they have done rather than what they have demonstrated they can do. I'll give you a couple of examples. So they've attended a steering committee, or they've worked near a PMO, or they've been on a transformation program, for example. But I guess the question that needs to be asked is, were they driving delivery, or were they just adjacent to it? Obviously, when you're hiring for a complex environment, you need people who can take ownership and not people who just understand the project and PMO language. Perfect. All right. Before I hop onto the next step of the process, where we cover interviewing in step 4, I want to first provide some context around it. Assessing candidates, especially in an interview environment, is a very specific skill, and there is a reason that hiring managers often feel this is the place they come unstuck. Take it from me. I interview lots of different types of project and PMO people, and it is a very specific skill that I've honed over time. And I think the broad advice I would give is, before you go into your interviewing stage, really understand the person you need and the purpose the role is filling. On the slide here, I have a little sneak peek into some resources I am creating in the same vein as this webinar to assist hiring managers in the recruitment process, but you are looking at what we have coined the 5 elements of a strong hiring brief. While this is obviously something to consider in the designing the role phase back in step 2, I have highlighted it here because interviewing candidates can be extremely overwhelming. And going into this phase, the interviewing phase that is, with the 5 key elements here concrete in your mind, will really set direction and create clarity in your assessment of candidates. So I'll quickly run through these. Number 1, the business problem. Why does the role exist, and what organisational problem is it solving? 2 is the outcomes. What will the new hire need to achieve in the first 30, 90, 180 days? This is one of many ways to understand outcomes, but a lot of hiring managers, especially in the project space, find that the 1, 3, and 6 month timeframe is easy to work with, often because it aligns with schedules and stage gates and things like that. Number 3, the scope. What responsibilities, ownership areas, and decision authority will the person have? 4, the stakeholder landscape. What people, teams, and stakeholder environments must this hire be able to navigate? And finally, 5, the candidate profile. What attributes, experience, and behaviours are needed for success in this role? Perfect. And on that note, we will move on to step 4. Once we have completed step 3, we've screened candidates, you have a bit of a shortlist. It's time to match talent to outcomes and culture. Some of these things may be highlighted in candidates' resumes, but the things I'll take you through on this slide really create the foundations in my interviewing questions and assessments for a given role. At a high level, I match to 3 things. 1 is delivery outcomes. I mentioned delivery outcomes earlier in this webinar, and assessing for them, but here I mean the type of delivery outcomes. Do they have experience delivering similar projects, programs, or portfolios? Whether that means similar scope, similar budget, anything of that sort. This is what I'm referring to when I'm saying matching. This is the matching phase of this process. Number 2 is complexity of the environment. Again, matching the candidate's experience to your environment. Have they worked in highly regulated industries before? Do they know how to manage your type of stakeholders? Do they have experience corresponding with your industry's regulatory bodies, etc.? And number 3 is organisational culture. And culture here doesn't mean, would I have a coffee with them? Culture means how decisions get made, how conflict is handled, what pace the organisation expects, how accountability works, what behaviours get rewarded, and also alignment between organisational values and the candidate's personal values. This, I believe, is one of the most overlooked parts of hiring, especially in complex environments, because a person can be strong but still fail in the wrong culture. For example, some organisations are very structured, governance heavy, and process driven, and others are sort of fast paced and agile and ambiguous and require people to operate with less direction, frankly. If you put the wrong profile into the wrong environment, you'll get frustration on both ends. And even if the person is technically qualified or even technically excellent. And then the last thing I touch on here is the behavioural side. In high pressure environments, the best candidates tend to demonstrate calm decision making, emotional maturity, clarity in communication, accountability, and the ability to work through conflict without escalating it, because delivery capability is not just technical. It's very human-centered, and soft skills must be assessed and are frankly a must-have. Perfect. So I'll finish with a more recent example that really brings step 4 that we've just discussed to life a little bit. We were engaged by a fast-growing pharmaceutical organisation recently to hire a PMO lead. As with a lot of our engagements, we partnered closely with them upfront to design the role and define what success looked like in their environment. One of the early discussions centred around industry experience. They obviously recognised that candidates from a pharmaceutical background would bring clear advantages, familiarity with regulatory bodies, an understanding of compliance requirements, and frankly, the ability to step in and deliver with minimal ramp up. However, at the outset, this wasn't positioned as a firm requirement or a must-have. As we moved through the sourcing assessment and began having deeper conversations about the fit, however, it did become clearer when we looked at the role through the lens of step 4, matching to delivery outcomes, environmental complexity, and organisational culture. Pharmaceutical experience wasn't just a nice to have. It was directly linked to all 3 outlined in step 4. It influenced how quickly someone could deliver outcomes. It aligned with the regulatory and governance complexity of the pharmaceutical environment. And it matched the pace, expectations, and ways of working within the organisational culture. So at that point, we made the conscious pivot in search. In turn, the brief became more targeted, the candidate pool became smaller but far more relevant, and ultimately the quality of conversations improves significantly. And I think that's a very important point to end on. These kinds of realizations don't always happen at the beginning. They often emerge as you move through the process, and that's completely okay. It definitely happens. The key is being able to recognize them, adjust your approach, and stay aligned to what the role actually requires to successfully deliver. All right. So to wrap up, if you walk away with one thing today, I'd like it to be a reframing of recruitment. Recruitment isn't about filling roles. I'm quite passionate about that, if you can't tell. It's about diagnosing delivery risk and solving project problems before they happen. Obviously, what I've been able to cover today is one of many high-level frameworks that you could use. If anyone wants to have more specific conversations about your organisational circumstances, please do feel free to reach out to me. I'm always more than happy to have a chat. But I do hope these steps on the screen highlighted here at a high level did resonate with you. I will just mention, if this was a lot to digest or was of significant interest to you, as I alluded to throughout the webinar, I am working on some exciting resources to help you go about your next hiring process with intention. The first one will be launching next week on Wednesday, the 8th of April. So look out for that. And if you aren't already following me and the Pledge Consulting page on LinkedIn, please feel free to. That is where these resources will get published. Thank you so much for joining me today, everyone. I'd love to open it to a few questions if anyone has any. Were there any questions in the chat? Okay, perfect. I'll leave it a couple of minutes. Yep, I'll stop sharing so that I can see the chat for 1 second. I mean, while we're waiting, I do typically get a few questions when I run through this, or a few questions / comments when I run through this presentation. And I'll quickly cover a few of those. I am conscious of time. I did say 40 minutes, so I'll cut it at 4:40. But
I think BJ had a question, Rachel.
Oh, who was that? Sorry.
BJ has a question.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks, Louise. I have a nuanced, I didn't understand the nuance, Rachel, when you mentioned that you should look for a candidate on what they have done and rather than demonstrate what they can do. Is it the way you ask a question? Is it the way you frame these interview questions to understand the nuance difference between them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, that was where I was referring to what they can do versus can do versus has done. So that's a thing that's sort of addressed at interview stage, definitely, and it's the way that you approach interview questions. So it's all about how you interview and assess. So there are plenty of ways and, plenty of frameworks of different interview questions you can ask to assess their capability and things. But it could really simply look like, what have you personally owned? What decisions have you made in previous projects? And, what changed because of the changes that you made or the things that you owned within the project. So I say, you look for answers that demonstrate ownership.
Got it. Okay. So that actually helps to understand if it's not just something that they can do, but what they have already done.
Yes, absolutely. So I think, I'm not sure if you were there for, they've been, I'm not sure if you sort of heard me mention, they've been sort of adjacent to a PMO or adjacent to a transformation, but asking very sort of specific questions about what they've owned, what went off track and how did you recover it? What was the most complex projects that you've delivered, and what made it challenging? Questions that demonstrate clear ownership, and you're really looking for people to answer with I instead of we. So direct ownership would probably be the number one key that I would highlight there.
Thanks, Rachel. It was a quite insightful session. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. That's nice.